Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/heroes, villains, and sidekicks. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Episode 46, The Punisher. Hi, this is Kevin Volo, and on this episode of the Heroes, Villains, and Sidekicks show, we're going to be looking at a character that's been in the news quite a bit lately due to Netflix's new show. Netflix new show? I don't know, how does that one work? But I'm talking about The Punisher. So we're going to be talking about The Punisher, a.k.a. Frank Castle, and that is his real name, and I'll be referring to him as both Punisher and Frank. And, again, this is one of these characters that, some consider a hero, some consider a crazy person who kills a lot of people. I kind of think of him as both. So that's what he does. He's Batman, but he kills people, and we're going to get into a little bit of that later. I'm also super excited about this episode because I got to interview Gerry Conway again. This is the man who created The Punisher along with several other amazing characters and iconic characters throughout both in all comic book universes. Just an incredible man, and it was an honor for me to speak to him, and just really nice of him to take his time to speak to me. And that's going to be, of course, at the end of the episode, so make sure you stick around and listen to that. So first, let's talk about The Punisher's history, some of the movie stuff, because he's been in a bunch of movies, and some small screen stuff. What I want to concentrate on a lot is, I'm not going to be walking through so much of the, this happened in War Journal and this happened in. I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that we don't see a lot of in the books that were sort of like one-shots and or little 4-issue specials where we really get a background and we have Frank more fleshed out. So we know what he does. He's a mission, vengeance, taking out criminals, the mob. But how did all that happen and why? And what was it like for him? And we're getting some of that in the Netflix show when we see him in Daredevil. But let's look at the history of the comic, Frank in the comic. So The Punisher was created by writer Gerry Conway and artist John Romita Sr., the amazing John Romita Sr., and Russ Andrew from Marvel Comics, and he first appeared in The Amazing Spider-Man number 129, which was published back in 1974. And of course, that book is crazy expensive now if you can find it anywhere. It's going to cost you a ton of money. And of course, if you get it like by CGC or something, it's going to be even more. But that's where he came out, 129. And the character, he was just supposed to be like a one-off or a B-list character. They didn't really expect a lot out of him. And he had a really interesting beginning because Conway first actually named the character Assassin. But Stan Lee, the editor-in-chief of Marvel at the time, thought that was a little too dark, even for an anti-hero, and said, why not call him the Punisher? And that's what happened. Conway said, okay, and he became the Punisher. And not only did his name change, but his suit changed a little bit. Conway sort of sketched off a drawing, and there was a little skull on his chest, and John Romita Sr. enlarged it to cover his entire chest. So the character, was really born of a bunch of different really creative people, but of course Conway is the main one who thought of this character. And he was first drawn by Andrew in Amazing Spider-Man 129, and to everybody's surprise in the creative team, Conway, who created him, the character took off. And he just kept going. So in Spider-Man 129, the Punisher's first appearance, we find him working for the Jackal. This is one of Spider-Man's oldest foes. He's the villain responsible for that whole clone mess that keeps cropping up. So he's that guy. He's the clone guy. And he tricks the Punisher into working for him, convincing Frank that Spider-Man is a villain and a murderer. Now, the Jackal uses the fact that, I guess technically, Spider-Man murdered Norman Osborn on accident, right? He let the glider crash into him or just crashed into him, so he uses that and, whatever J. Jonah Jameson's saying. And it's kind of surprising because the Punisher's fairly gullible. He believes it. I mean, do a little fact checking. Talk to Spider-Man first. No, he doesn't. So he goes after him, and Frank thinks he's a bad guy, and using his straightforward code that villains die and criminals die, he goes after Spider-Man. Now, interesting thing though, Frank does say he repeatedly says he does not take pleasure in killing, but it needs to be done to eliminate these criminals. So right off the bat, especially in the late 70s and early 80s, this was very radical. No, quote unquote hero killed, right? They cracked you in the jaw, made a few witty remarks, and they took you off to jail. I mean, not the Punisher. He killed you, end of story. So the Punisher in the Spider-Man is his first appearance, quickly realizes that the Jackal is putting one over on him. He realizes that Spider-Man is not a villain because he sees him saving some people. The Jackal also tries to frame Frank for the murder of somebody else that the Jackal actually killed. And he realizes, okay, this is not a good idea. He lets Spider-Man go, and Spider-Man lets him go. I don't think he had much of a choice at the time, but Frank gets away. And then he pops up again in Amazing Spider-Man 134 and 135. And again, he stumbles onto Spidey trying to fight a bad guy, the Tarantula, and he thinks Spidey's the bad guy. And of course, then again, he realizes quite quickly after he punches Spider-Man a few times and they fight that Spider-Man isn't a bad guy, and he lets him go. Now, these early appearances of Frank, Castle, the Punisher, are interesting because, he isn't the character we think of now. I mean, he's gritty for the time, but, we don't really see him kill anybody in these issues. He's got the guns, but a lot of times he uses some concussion guns and some things when he's trying to get Spider-Man until the end when he's going to kill him, but of course doesn't. Now, all of these things change, of course, as we get into, the 80s and the 90s especially, where more and more heroes were getting grittier and darker, and anti-heroes were becoming all the rage. So it was really funny, though, to see this really early version of Frank. I have to say I dug his hair, how they drew him in this. He looked very angular. He doesn't have that sort of boxer punched in the face too many times look to him. He's a lot more suave looking, of course. And in the first appearance and subsequent appearances, he is rocking the go-go boots, the white boots, the white gloves. I mean, only a guy carries that many guns and will just kill you can get away with wearing white go-go boots. I dig that. So that was the Punisher's. And even that at the time was really sort of gutsy of a costume, quote unquote costume, because, everyone wore, bright colors and capes. And here was a guy that wore all black with some white in this skull. And of course, the suit reflects his belief system. It's black and white. You're good, you're evil. There is no gray in the Punisher's world. So we know Frank has a war against crime, and he believes that, criminals should be killed. He hates criminals, but why? We don't really find out in The Amazing Spider-Man. Maybe something's alluded to, but we don't know his motivation. We get the first Punisher origin story in the black and white comic magazine Marvel Preview, and it's in issue 2. These are like oversized, they're magazine size, they're black and white, beautiful art. And the story was written by Gerry Conway, which is apropos, right? He created the character, with some amazing black and white art by, I'm going to kill his last name, Tony Dzunga? I am sorry, Tony. I cannot, Dzunga. I'm going to say Dzunga. It's just amazing stuff, incredible. And again, you can go over to the site, heroesvillainsandsidekicks.com. I've got a bunch of pages from it and from all the things I'm going to be talking about, all the eras of Frank. I've got pages and images, but these black and whites are just beautiful. And this is where we first see what happened with Frank. And here he is. He's out having a wonderful day with his family. He's got a beautiful wife. He's got 2 small children, a boy and a girl. His wife's name is Maria. And they're having a picnic in Central Park, and mobsters have a rival gun battle. This gun battle between these rival mobsters happen, and his family is caught in the crossfire. His wife, his little boy, his little girl are killed, shot dead in front of him. I mean, it's a simple origin, but very effective. We see what happens to Frank. His kids under the age of 10 or 11 are gunned down. They die in his arms. His wife is dead, and his entire life is gone over. You can see, obviously, what that could do to somebody. Now, couple that with, I think, his military upbringing, his military service, because he's a military guy. We'll talk about that later. He's able to sort of compartmentalize what's happened to them and then, sort of use it to go on this mission. Is he any different than Batman? I mean, a lot of people will compare the two. Is he any different than Batman? The characters have been compared. And they even fought in the Marvel DC crossover. Again, I'll put a page on the site, heroesvillainsandssidekicks.com for that. It was a neat little crossover. I mean, both have went through really the most horrible things that that can happen to an individual. They made the decision to shut off a huge part of themselves and become something, really, if you think about it, neither one of their loved ones would have ever wanted them to become. I mean, I'm sure Bruce's parents would have wanted him to, get help, get past it, and have a wonderful, happy life. And I'm sure, Frank's wife would have wanted the same, but of course this didn't happen. I think their parents, Batman's parents and the Punisher's wife and kids would have it would have broken their hearts to see what became of their children, no matter what, good that they did. But of course, that's what happened. They used that pain and, used it to inflict pain of their own. And we get to see a little bit of that pain. And this is in one of these mini-series that I had not even been familiar with, really. I did collect some Punisher, back in the 80s and 90s, and a little bit in the Innis era that we'll be talking about. But not a ton of, the little side books and whatnot. So it was really interesting when I was doing some research to come across this mini-series, Punisher Year One. And in it, sort of the takeoff on the whole Batman Year One and whatnot, we see Frank's origin story replayed, but we also then get to see what he's like days and the first weeks after his family is murdered. And it's really interesting to see the Punisher still, he's still just a regular guy. He's still a ex-military guy. He's a father. He's a widower. He is someone who has gone through the worst thing any parent could go through. And we see him as a man. He's not the Punisher yet. And he's out of his mind, depressed, with sorrow. He is taken to the hospital after his family was shot because he was also hit. And he wakes up in the hospital room and he just gets on his knees and he's, contemplating just ending his life somehow. When the mobsters who were in the park hired some hitmen to go kill him in case he recognized anyone. And they walked in and he was just on his knees. It's a beautiful page. It's over on the site. And he knows they're there. And the gunman put the gun right up to his head. And Frank whispers Maria, his wife's name. And the hitman says, "Yeah, I got your Maria right here," which was obviously the biggest mistake he could have made because Frank's hand just shot up and just crushed the guy's hand around the gun. And then, he beat the heck out of him. So, I mean, he doesn't kill him. He's not the Punisher yet. He's about to. I don't know if he would have, but the gun's to his head, and the police actually come in because he was under protective custody, but the cop got taken out. And they say, "Don't do it. Don't ruin your life." So he doesn't. And then he goes and works with the police to try to find the people who did this. And unfortunately, though, they try to arrest this guy, and he has fake alibis because he's a mobster and he's all lawyered up. And Frank is in despair because of this, and he actually tries to kill himself again. He has the gun right to his head, but he can't go through with it. And he realizes he's going to make these people pay. And the book ends with him, painting the skull onto his flak jacket and, going out to do some business. So it was a really interesting series. The art was interesting. It was I liked it. I liked reading through it. I think what kept my interest in it was it showed some dimension to the character that you don't usually get. Okay, so let's go back to when the Punisher, before he was getting all his little spin-offs and stuff, back into the early 80s. He's in the Spider-Man books a few more times in the 70s and 80s. And then he makes some really notable appearances in the pages of Daredevil, where the differences in the characters are shown in pretty stark contrast. I mean, both have a code. Murdoch is a lawyer. Daredevil's a lawyer. Murdoch's a lawyer. He believes that a criminal should, even though he's a criminal, should go through the courts, should never be killed. Obviously, Frank does not have that compunction. He believes they should be killed. And there's some really cool fights going on in there. And, of course, those actually carry over into the Netflix episode where Daredevil and the Punisher fight. It is pretty awesome. And I got some links on the site to some of those videos. Now, it's actually not until 1986 that the Punisher gets his own series. And it's not even a full run. It's a 5-issue miniseries written by Steve Grant and drawn by Mike Zeck. And the funny thing is, if you pick up the first issue, you'll see that it says it's a 4-issue miniseries. That's actually a typo that carried through most of the books, except for, I think, issue 5. It says 5 on it. But this is one of also the books that really launched Zeck in the 80s. His art was really cool, and it fit the time. I mean, really expressive faces, big heroes, pretty cool stuff. I actually remember being at one of the my first cons, and it was a really small one, and he was there. And I was just starting to get some sketches, and I asked him, what his sketches were going for. And he said $50. And now this was 1987, and that was a huge amount of money for a sketch back then. I mean, it's a lot of money now for a sketch. $1987, I think, I'm no economist, but that's like almost $1.2 million today, easily, I think. And true, he was huge, but it was just way out of my price range. I couldn't do it. And I said, nope, sorry. The funny thing is, at the same show, I got a sketch from Greg Capullo of Daredevil for nothing. So that'll tell you just how, of course, Greg Capullo wasn't huge at the time like Zeck was, but I'm glad I got that Capullo sketch. I'm really glad I got that. Now, in this first of his own series where he's the leading man, it starts with Frank in jail. And he's actually gets sprung by an organization that calls itself the Trust. And they're for ending crime. In his style, they like the whole vigilante, kill him and, don't worry about the law type of thing. And, they get him out and he starts continuing his mission, killing criminals, going after mobsters. And there's actually even a love interest in this book, a woman named Angela. But problem is that she's actually working for the Trust. They are not really all that great. They're actually... they blew up Punisher's van to make him more dependent on them. They're not really good people, and they don't have a code. Like, he might be killing people, but he has a code. So he, of course, leaves them, and he doesn't have anything to do with them again. And, it's a fairly one-dimensional series, but it helps build Frank's character, defining him as a loner. But the series was a hit, of course, and the Punisher got a green light for his own series. And again, he got a stellar cast to man his book. I mean, it's incredible. The initial team was helmed by writer Mike Barron, who's amazing, and just one of my all-time favorite artists and inkers, Klaus Janson. This book is just beautiful. I'm a huge fan of Klaus Janson, and the book is just nice to look at. And I reread the first 5 episodes, and I have to say the art holds up amazingly well. I couldn't get into the story so much, but at the same time, I do remember when I first bought them, I really, really enjoyed it. But again, the art, just to see Klaus Janson's art, I would love to see it in black and white because I'm sure it's incredible. Now a word from our sponsor. For you, the listeners of the Heroes, Villains, and Sidekicks show, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. Now, personally, I recommend It. I've never read Stephen King's It, and of course the movie is a big hit, and I saw it. I loved it. My son saw it. It was one of his first scary movies, and he loved it. And you can go over to Audible and get it. It's written, of course, by Stephen King. It's narrated by Steven Weber. It is 44 hours and 57 minutes long, totally unabridged. So you can head over there and get 44 hours of Stephen King, It, for free. So you just head over to, let me find that address again, audibletrial.com/heroes, villains, and sidekick. Again, that's audibletrial.com/heroes, villains, and sidekicks. You can get your free audiobook right over there. Now back to the show. So this was the era of the Punisher. I mean, this in the 80s and 90s, his main title was spun off into several titles. We had the Punisher War Journal, the Punisher War Machine, the Punisher Armory, and of course he was popping up in several titles doing little cameos. Now, that is a lot of titles, and I mean, the character can be fairly one-dimensional. He finds criminals, he kills criminals, and how long can you do that and people not, the character not get a little stale? And that's what happened. It was the overexposure. And after his initial title, The Punisher, the one that Jansen and Barron did, that ended at issue 104, which is a great run. And the other series like Warzone and War Journal, they didn't last much longer. They were pretty much died out, and all of them were canceled in 1995. Now, he would return here and there, most notably, I say notably, the Punisher miniseries, The Punisher Purgatory, and notably isn't quite right. To me, it's the lowest point in Punisher history, and fans of the Punisher, I think, the Purgatory miniseries is the title which thou shalt not speak. And what happens is it actually starts with Frank, I don't know if it starts with it, but Frank is like crawling out of his grave. And we find that he killed himself. He shot himself in the head, and he has now been brought back. And he has these mystical guns that are glowing. It's terrible. It's terrible. And there's some images over on the site, heroesvillainsandsidekicks.com, if you want to see it. And thankfully that went away, and they actually just gave Frank a break at that point. He might have shown up here and there, but he didn't have his own title for quite a while. Now, Frank was brought back by Marvel in style again in early 2000, putting together just another incredible team. Probably, to me, the best team. I mean, I love Klaus Janson, but where do you hear this? And you may be familiar with them because they're the powerhouse team behind Preacher. Yep, I'm talking about writer Garth Ennis and the late, great Steve Dillon. I mean, picture that type of writing and that type of just expressive art and just violent art, the goriness that Steve Dillon was able to do. And I mean, I love these two together. I mean, I did a whole series of Preacher episodes for the past 2 months. You can subscribe to check those out over at iTunes. And when you're over to iTunes, if you get a second, leave a quick review. I'd really appreciate it. I know we got a lot of downloads. We got a lot of listeners. I know it's hard sometimes to just hop over there and do a review, but I would really appreciate it. It helps the site out and the podcast out. It moves it up the rankings, and it helps people learn about us. So if you get a second and you're already subscribing to be able to listen to these episodes and know when they're coming out, especially all those Preacher ones, we compare it with the show and to the comic. They're fun. Leave a review. That'd be great. So this team really ramps up the action and the violence of the Punisher. And if you remember some of the ultraviolet violent pages from the Punisher that I posted over on the site, where, like the Saint of Killers is blowing away people. They do the same thing with the Punisher. There's body parts, there's torn flesh. I mean, it's just crazy. They also go ahead and revamp the Punisher's look. They get rid of the white gloves, the white go-go boots. Although, like I said, no one rocks the go-go boots, white go-go boots like the Punisher. His new look is very straightforward, very down-to-earth, even farther removed from the traditional superhero. He has just, he keeps the black t-shirt, or the black whatever it is, I'm sure it's some kind of bulletproof vest, with the black skull. And but now he just has like combat boots and combat pants and sometimes a black trench coat. And this is how it's pretty much now been from then until now. Every once in a while, they'll do something with him in his costume. I believe for one of the newer events where Cap turned out to be bad, he was in his uniform. But, he usually wears just, civvies with this black shirt. And this Innis run is just fantastic. It goes into, he's able to do even more because then DC, and then Marvel launches its Max line, which lets him do just even, more violent stuff, more adult-oriented stuff, and it really resets the Punisher. It resets him away from the campiness he got and just the almost ridiculous, especially when he was this supernatural being, to this down-to-earth anti-hero on a mission. Okay. Now, the Punisher is also one of those characters, for a character that no one thought was going to go anywhere. He has had a lot of life off the comic page. I mean, there have been quite a few feature films. The first was actually released way back in 1989, and it starred, of all people, Dolph Lundgren. And I remember most people, even then, unfortunately, were like, oh, he's not the Punisher, it's not going to look good. And I just remember being excited for it, though, because, I mean, it was one of the first comic book movies that was like of a different sort of character. It wasn't Batman, it wasn't Superman. And I was really excited. And I remember it wasn't too bad. Now, I haven't watched it since then. It might be horrible. But I remember at the time, I dug it. And there were actually a couple other movies in 2004 and one in 2008. But I never really think they got the character right. And that's really until Frank and the Punisher there showed up on Netflix's Daredevil show. So Daredevil is Jessica Jones, and I think the Netflix show go, in my opinion, in popularity for me. Jessica Jones, just because I love the character, and Purple Man. Daredevil, Luke Cage, and then Iron Fist, which wasn't as bad as everyone says. I have to say that I couldn't finish watching it, so I guess it technically was as bad. I just jumped right into Defenders. But Frank and the Punisher show up in Daredevil, and this is kind of going back to this amazing few episodes or issues back. I think it was 182, 183, 184, maybe 185, where the Daredevil's in Daredevil and the Punisher fight in the comic, and a lot of it is very reminiscent of that. They're on a roof in the comic, just like they're on a roof on the Netflix show. So here we got to see the Punisher, and I mean, wow. The Punisher in the Daredevil show is being played by The Walking Dead's John Bernthal, and the actor who played Shane. And I mean, if anybody looks like the modern era Punisher, how he's been drawn for the past 10 years, 15 years, he does. I mean, it's just his mannerisms, his voice, his personality. He is just knocking it out of the park. And of course, we knew it at the time, or we were hoping it at the time, that Netflix has now given The Punisher his own series. And you've seen probably some of the ads and some of the trailers. I actually have the trailer to all the movies and the newest trailer from Netflix over on the site, heroesvillainsandsidekicks.com. You can go over and watch those. So now we're going to see Frank brought to the small screen, and I think this is going to be one of the best portrayals of the Punisher that we have ever seen in any other media than comics. I am super looking forward to it. He, a lot of times I'll say he was we're going to be talking about my favorite character. The Punisher's never been one of my favorite characters. It's been a character that I was always interested in, because I look at him as this sort of different sort of foil against someone like Daredevil, whom I love as a character. The two sides of the same coin. They both believe in the same thing, but they have different methods. And I'm really interested to see, hopefully, what I'm hoping for is they add more of Frank into the Netflix show than Punisher. Yes, we're going to have guns going off, people are going to be getting a shot, but I want to learn more about the guy and why he became the Punisher and what it's done to his life. So I'm really super excited for it. The Punisher is, again, great character, legs that have lasted a long time. Now we're going to get to listen to an interview I did with Gerry Conway about the creation of the Punisher and his thoughts on the character. And again, it's something. It was a great honor for me, and I really, like I said, really appreciate him talking to me. So here, without further ado, Gerry Conway. I was a huge Spider-Man fan, and that was one of my favorite issues back in the day.
Oh, great.
And yeah, just fantastic. And now this is a new character. This isn't somebody like a Jason Todd, which you're sort of bringing back or you're changing. So how did the idea of creating this sort of anti-hero, I don't know if he'd be considered an anti-hero, but how does a character like that sort of come into your head?
Well, in the Punisher's case, it was sort of answering a bunch of questions that I had for a particular storyline that I was developing. I was introducing a new character called the Jackal, who was the main thrust of what was going to be the arc of stories leading up to the Gwen Stacy clone.
Yeah.
And one of the methods that I thought was effective to introduce a character who's going to be a master villain is to show him in a relationship to a strong secondary villain who he's hired to do something for him. So, you establish someone's power by showing that he has power over somebody else, that kind of thing. So to do that, I wanted to create a one-issue character that would be a menace to Spider-Man, put Spider-Man in jeopardy, and be somebody that wasn't going to be important enough that it would detract from the interest of this other character. So that was the approach that I was taking. And as I was doing it, this was at a time when there were a variety of these kind of vigilante storylines out there. And I thought that would make for an interesting idea that, a guy who thinks he's fighting crime recklessly is misdirected into going against a superhero who is actually fighting crime. So that, to me, had some nice friction to it, some nice potential tension. And then from that, I built this character up. But as I was building the character up and working with the artists on the costume design, I started to think, this guy's got real potential. He's a more interesting character than just a throwaway one-shot villain. So in the writing of that issue, and then the artwork that Ross Andrew drew, we looked at this thing and said, this guy's really great. Let's bring him back for another story. And that was before we even had fan reaction to it. So it started out as one thing and became something else, because most of the characters that I personally enjoy writing are characters that are in conflict to their avowed status. And what I mean by that is that you have a character who's a good guy, but he's got a dark secret, and that dark secret may undermine his ability to be a good guy. That, to me, starts making an interesting character. Here was a character who starts out as a bad guy, but he's a bad guy for good reasons. And then you start having tension in that character, and that makes for a morally complex character story, which is why I think the character has legs, and can be reinterpreted many times down during the years.
Well, I mean, yeah, we've always, everyone's always had those discussions. Well, not a lot of people, but in comic book stores, where you're like, well, why doesn't Batman could just get rid of the Joker and everything would be fine?
Right.
This person should just shoot this person, bad guy, and it would be over with. And here was a character that did that.
Yeah. And you see, that's not always a good answer. Because it's like a permanent answer to a flexible question. Yeah, I mean, in a way, the Punisher going after Spider-Man for what seems to him to be morally justifiable reasons raises that entire question of when is it morally justifiable to kill somebody? It's like we say, that's the essence of Batman's dilemma, and what I thought made for a pretty good video game in Injustice, is that once you leave your own personal code behind, is there anything left? Is there anything that you're actually fighting for? But what if your code is wrong? That's the Punisher question.
Yeah.
You see, Batman's code is relentlessly, I won't kill somebody just to prevent greater harm. And that causes him enormous problems. But he's right. You don't kill somebody just to prevent greater harm because you don't know what the consequence is going to be. So then we have a character like Punisher where his moral code says, I will kill somebody to prevent greater harm. Now you have the opportunity of exploring what are the consequences of that, of that moral code. How does that affect his ability to be a force for good? So I love that,
Yeah. And whereas Batman, yes, he has that code, and I think it helps him be able to almost function. Because, there's this one thing you can, it's a peg and it doesn't move, whereas the sand has got to be shifting for the Punisher, because it just does.
Well, it's in both cases, the strength is the weakness, right? Yeah. The weakness that Batman has is that he won't kill somebody. But the strength that he has is that he will kill somebody. Now, in Punisher, the weakness that he has is that he will kill somebody. But the strength that he has is that he will kill somebody. So it's both his superpower and his greatest flaw.
Yeah.
And it's why he's not a good guy, in my view.
Yeah.
He may be a protagonist. We may want to follow him. But, I just wrote my first Punisher story in years last year, and the essence of the Punisher's point to another character in that story was, I'm not a good man. I'm not a good guy. So don't praise me. Don't emulate me. Yeah. I can do the things that you can't do, but that's why I'm not as good as you.
Yeah. Don't call me a hero.
Yeah. I'm not a hero.
And here he is now on, he's going to have his own Netflix show, and he was on Daredevil.
Yeah. But interestingly, they treat him as a broken man. They treat him as a hero in the sense that what he's doing is ultimately for the good. And when we create, I assume they create situations where he's justified, but they don't say that that this is a good way to live.
Well, they really build up the sympathy for his family dying, the trauma from the war, but I think in Daredevil they did walk a really good line in this guy this isn't right.
He's a broken man. He has a bullet in his head.
Yeah.
That I think is wonderful symbolism. The break, in him.
Yeah.
So it's cool.
Yeah, fantastic character. Well, Gerry, I want to thank you for, again, taking the time on a Saturday to talk to me about these two great characters. And
you're welcome.
I've loved your work for a very long time, so this was a definite honor to be able to talk to you today.
Oh, well, thank you. And I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks a lot, Gerry.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye. So, wow, great guy. And the funny thing is you almost didn't get to hear him talk about the Punisher because I almost asked him, I didn't want to take up too much of his time, and you might have heard we said about these two characters. If you haven't heard it, I did an episode on Jason Todd. He, of course, created Jason Todd, and we talked about him. And then he had a little bit more time, and I asked him about the Punisher, and I almost asked him about Firestorm, because he created Firestorm too, and Firestorm has always been one of my favorite all-time characters. So if you like the Punisher and you enjoyed that, there you go. But part of me wanted to ask him about Firestorm. Hopefully I can schedule another call with him and do that. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode. The interview, I've lined up a bunch of more interviews. I'm going to try to do at least 1 or 2 a month to get them out there. They're a little hard to schedule, but I'm working on it. I do love to be able to do these interviews. I get to speak to some of my most favorite creators. It's really fun. If you've got someone you want to hear from, I can try to get an interview. Go ahead and you can leave a message over on our Facebook group. Just search for Heroes, Villains, and Sidekicks. We'll pop right up. Got a nice little community over there. Or even send me an email. You can contact me. There's the contact information on the site, heroesvillainsandsidekicks.com. Or you could leave a message in the episode post for this page. So if you haven't ever gone over to the site, if you go to heroesvillainsandsidekicks.com, on the episodes page, there is a post for every one of our podcasts. And there I have pretty much the transcript of the podcast, along with just tons of photos and videos. So head over there and check it out. And again, leave a message, maybe who you'd want to hear from next, interview-wise and or just character-wise. So this is Kevin Volo. I want to thank you for listening to the Heroes, Villains, and Sidekicks show. We'll be back next week with more.